Lectures on the Basics of Biblical Greek. Chapter 34. Since the middle of Greek 1, as we have been working on verb forms, all the verbs have been from the omega conjugation, and is that conjugation we used to determine verbal function and syntax. By the omega conjugation, we mean those verbs, the dictionary forms of which end in either omega or omicron, mu, alpha, iota. In other words, all verbs in this conjugation use thematic vowels, connecting vowels, omicron or epsilon. Now, to be sure, there are some contractions and some consonantal changes as forms are done, but the patterns are fairly familiar, and the recurrence of these thematic vowels gives to us the identification of this conjugation as the omega conjugation. In terms of syntax and function, namely how verbs work according to their form, personal endings, tense and voice are helpers, but moods in particular determine usage, with indicative giving claimed reality, subjunctive potential reality, imperative commands and exhortations, infinitives are verbal nouns, participles are verbal adjectives. But in this lesson, we'll discover that there is another conjugation, and that new conjugation comes to us with both good news and bad news. We're going to learn 5 rules by which we can work with this other conjugation, and by the end of our session, we'll be able to at least parse the indicative active of didomi and translate this verb in some sentences from the Gospel of John. First of all, there is another conjugation. A conjugation is a pattern through which a verb inflects to give all of its various meanings. The other conjugation is athematic. It has no theme vowel, no connecting vowels in the present. It's sometimes called the me conjugation because the lexical forms end not in omega, as in Leo, but in me, as didomi. We've actually already learned some of those forms of one verb, eimi. It's in this general pattern. So what's the good news, bad news situation about this new conjugation? After all, we've spent months on the first one. Well, the bad news is that the forms change drastically. Some of them don't look anything like the omega conjugation. The good news is that there are very few me verbs. But the bad news is these few me verbs are pretty common in the New Testament. The good news is that most of the tough forms are in the present. The bad news is that when you put these verbs completely together, there are some 330 new forms. We could memorize those forms, but we wouldn't remember them very long. So instead, I offer this good news. This lesson will teach you 5 rules that will help you identify most of them. And the ones you don't identify, you'll do like I do, and just look them up in a chart. So, here we go. There are 4 classes of me verbs, and in addition to the dictionary form, it's probably a very good idea to learn the root of each one. So in today's lesson, didomi, the root is da. In future lessons, histemi, the root is sta. Tithemi, the root is tha. And deiknemi, the root is dekni. So what are the 5 rules that help us identify forms? We take them up one at a time. Rule number 1, iota reduplication. Me verbs, athematic verbs, reduplicate the initial consonant of the root to form the present and separate the reduplicated consonant with a iota. So from the root da, the reduplication is did, iota reduplication, and that's an indicator of the present stem being involved. So if iota reduplication is present, one is either dealing with a present tense or an imperfect tense, since both are built off the present tense stem and would have iota reduplication. If epsilon reduplication is present, then one is dealing with a perfect tense, not a present tense. So rule number 1 is iota reduplication. Let's take some examples. Didos, present. Edokas, notice no reduplication of either kind, but an augment has to be aorist. Dead has to be perfect. Did has to be present. Da with an epsilon has to be aorist. Dead has to be perfect. The reduplication characteristic of the me verbs is exceedingly helpful in the parsing process, because you'll notice the last two forms, edokate and dedokate, are identical except for the presence of the delta at the beginning of the perfect. If just the root is present, a da, it's either a future or an aorist. If did is present, it's a present or an imperfect. If dead is present, it's a perfect tense. Rule number 2. Me verbs are athematic in the presence. That is, the present tense of me verbs does not use a connecting vowel. Notice the parts. Di, that's the reduplication. Da, that's the root. Men, that's the personal ending. Didamen. However, in the imperfect, is the augment. Di, reduplication, to make a present stem. Da is the root. And then the connecting vowel, epsilon plus sigma. The omicron of the stem and the epsilon of the connecting vowel, omicron plus epsilon, contracts to oo, thus the form edidus for the second person singular, imperfect, indicative, active. So we have athematic presence, but the theme vowels reoccur in other tenses. Rule number 3. Misiasi. Just say that about 10 times. Misiasi. Misiasi. There are 3 new personal endings in the present active indicative of me verbs. And those endings are me, the first person singular, si, often followed by a movable nu in the third person singular, and asi, again, often followed by a movable nu in the third person plural. Misiasi. 3 new personal endings. These are the forms that get confusing. These are the forms that require memory. Misiasi, rule number 3. So our chart of personal endings in the primary active now has 2 forms for the first person singular, third person singular, and third person plural. One form is used with the omega conjugation, thematic vowel verbs, and the other is used with the athematic or me verbs. In all other cases, the regular personal endings are used. So, for example, in the present middle passive, maisaitai, methastatentai, all of those endings that we learned long ago show up perfectly with the athematic verb didamai, didasai, didatai, didamatha, didaste, didontai. Whereas in the thematic, we get that contraction with the psi in the second person singular, leading to li-a. The thematic form is the more irregular one. Rule number 4, crazy vowels. This is my favorite rule involving me verbs. And the description here is somewhat different from the more formal one in mounts. But the vowel of the stem or root just goes crazy. Sometimes the stem vowel lengthens, sometimes it shortens, and sometimes it disappears. So let's take the root da. Certain forms, that da will be an omicron. Certain forms, it'll lengthen to omega. And at times, it may even disappear. So the best thing to do is to ignore the stem vowel, except insofar as it helps you identify the root. Didomi. Stem vowel is lengthened. Didamen. No lengthening. It's the normal root. Di. With a sigma, behind that X, whether it's an omicron or an omega, doesn't matter. We've got iota reduplication and a sigma, that's second person singular. This is the reason, frankly, back with the thematic verbs, that we had you memorize the personal endings and not the personal endings with the connecting vowels, because it helps you now. Remembering those connecting vowels provides dissonance with the me verbs, which don't have them in the present active indicative. Rule number 5. Most me verbs use kappa alpha as their tense formative in the aorist. Not sigma alpha, but kappa alpha. So edoka is first person singular aorist indicative active. Whereas dedoka, the kappa alpha, looks the same, but look at the beginning. We've got epsilon reduplication. It has to be a perfect. Whereas with edoka, there's no epsilon duplication, so it can't be a perfect form. Kappa alpha, aorists. That's rule number 5. With these 5 rules, it is quite possible to parse almost all me verbs. Commit these rules to memory. Let's look at the indicative active, then, of the verb that is the focus of our instruction, didomi. Some items of note in this chart. Notice how both the present and the imperfect have did throughout, clearly built on a present stem. The future and the aorist just have da. In this case, the stem vowel is lengthened to omega, but they do not have iota or epsilon reduplication. Therefore, they can't be present, imperfect, or perfect. The one with the augment is aorist. The one with the sigma is future. Probably the hardest forms to recognize at first are the imperfects, because in the imperfect, the thematic vowel, that connecting vowel, returns and causes contraction with the stem vowel omicron. But not always. Look at didomen. There, the stem vowel disappeared. If it were still there, we'd have omicron plus omicron, giving us omicron upsilon. We don't have that form. The stem vowel has disappeared. But in the next form, it reappears, and there is no connecting vowel. Didote. I'm not sure how consistent this stuff is, but these are the explanations I have been offered. Again, best thing to do, just ignore those crazy vowels. Pay attention to augments, reduplication, and the personal endings. And let the crazy vowels do their crazy thing, as long as it doesn't keep you up at night. Let's end with a couple of sentences from the Gospel of John that illustrate various forms of didomi. The first sentence. Edoken autois exousia tekna theou genesthai. He gave, aorist form, notice augment plus da, not did. He gave them authority become children of God. The second sentence reads, Panta dedoken en te keri autou. Dedoken has epsilon reduplication, so it's a perfect tense, perfect active. He has given all things into his hand. Example number 3. Hosaan aitese ton theon dose soi ho theos. Dose, no epsilon or iota reduplication, just the stem, plus sigma and the primary ending, future tense. Whatever things you singular ask of God, God will give to you. And the last example, Kaire hobasilius ton eudion, kai edidusan auto rapismata. Edidusan, notice the did, means a present stem, but with an epsilon on front, therefore it must be imperfect. Hail, King of the Jews, the soldiers said. And they kept giving him blows, or perhaps they began to beat him, would be another way of translating this sentence. The form is imperfect. So in this lesson, we've learned about another conjugation, the athematic or me conjugation. Although the forms can look initially quite confusing, and there are many of them, by following the 5 rules identified in this lesson. Rule 1, iota reduplication in the present. Rule 2, no connecting vowels in the present. Rule 3, 3 new personal endings, me, si, and asi. Rule 4, the stem vowel can do crazy things. Rule 5, kappa alpha aorists in most cases. By memorizing these 5 rules, most forms can be identified and translated.